The House Judiciary Committee room was never quiet, not really. Even on the slowest days, the hum of whispered conversations, the shuffle of papers, and the click of staffers' keyboards filled the air. But on this particular Tuesday, a different kind of silence settled over the chamber, a silence that felt electric, as if everyone present sensed something unusual was about to unfold. The agenda was supposed to be routine, a hearing on a new civil rights enforcement proposal, the kind of technical, legalistic debate that rarely made headlines. But as Congressman Ted Lieu adjusted his glasses and leaned into his microphone, the mood shifted. The staffers paused mid-typing. The members stopped their side conversations. Even Chairman Jim Jordan, who usually relished the chance to needle his Democratic colleagues, sat back with a look of anticipation. "With all due respect to my colleague from Texas," Lieu began, his voice sharper than usual, "I have real concerns about the method being suggested here. Before we move forward, we should seriously consider whether Representative Crockett has the right legal experience to guide this initiative." A wave of silence rolled across the chamber. Members glanced at one another, some with surprise, others with a hint of discomfort. It was rare to see two prominent Democrats clash so openly, especially in front of the cameras. Chairman Jordan's lips curled into a small, satisfied smile. For once, he didn't have to stir the pot. The Democrats were doing it for him. Jasmine Crockett, the freshman representative from Texas, didn't flinch. She didn't even blink. Instead, she tilted her head slightly, a subtle gesture that signaled both curiosity and confidence. She opened the leather portfolio in front of her, her movements calm and deliberate. The room watched, waiting for a reaction, a retort, a flash of anger. But Crockett simply pulled out a single document and placed it on the table. "I appreciate Congressman Lieu's interest in my qualifications," she replied, her voice even and measured. "Perhaps this will answer his concerns." The heading at the top of the document caught the attention of those sitting nearby. Jerry Nadler, a veteran of countless committee battles, leaned in for a closer look. His eyes widened instantly. He recognized the case. The cameras zoomed in on Lieu's face as his confidence slipped into visible uncertainty. Whatever confrontation he had expected, this was clearly not part of his plan. Before the committee could process what was happening, the moment was already being clipped and shared online. "Ted Lieu questions Jasmine Crockett's credentials. Watch her response," blared the first viral tweet. But inside the room, the story was just beginning. Ted Lieu had built his reputation on being thorough, strategic, and exceptionally detail-oriented. A former Air Force JAG officer with degrees from Stanford and Georgetown law, he was widely respected for his legal expertise and disciplined communication style. He was serving his fifth term, and his colleagues on both sides of the aisle knew him as one of the House's leading legal thinkers. On this day, he arrived at the judiciary hearing with a clear purpose. The committee was reviewing a major proposal on civil rights enforcement, one that would give the Justice Department broader power to investigate police departments showing patterns of misconduct. Lieu, typically a supporter of police accountability, was cautious. He felt the legal structure behind the proposal wasn't being examined closely enough. Despite strong political momentum, his frustration was compounded by the fact that the proposal was being led by one of the newest members of Congress, Jasmine Crockett, just a year and a half into her first term. At 43, Crockett had already become one of the Democratic Party's boldest and fastest-rising voices. She had served as a civil rights attorney and Texas state legislator, winning her congressional seat on promises of justice reform and voting rights protection. Her legal work included major civil rights cases that gained national attention. But privately, Lieu questioned whether her courtroom experience fully prepared her to shape federal enforcement laws. "She's smart and passionate," he had confided to a colleague. "But this is complicated constitutional territory. We need accuracy, not just enthusiasm." The issue stretched far beyond committee debates. The proposal could reshape the relationship between the federal government and local police agencies across the country. Civil rights advocates praised the plan as a necessary step toward accountability, while police unions condemned it as excessive federal intrusion. Politically, the timing was delicate. With midterms approaching, Democrats were trying to energize their base without fueling Republican claims that they were anti-law enforcement. Crockett had quickly become the most visible spokesperson for the plan, appearing on major networks and writing opinion pieces urging lawmakers to act. As a black woman who had represented victims of police brutality, her voice carried significant weight within the party, but behind closed doors, senior Democrats, including Lieu, worried that her push for fast action might leave the proposal vulnerable to court challenges later. They feared that rushing the process could weaken the long-term impact of the reform. This hearing was supposed to be a technical discussion about implementation details, typically slow, behind-the-scenes work with little public interest. But Lieu believed core questions needed to be addressed openly before the proposal advanced. What no one expected was that Crockett had prepared herself for exactly this confrontation. Through staff conversations, she had heard about Lieu's doubts regarding her qualifications. The document now in front of her was more than a formality. It was her proof and her shield in a broader fight over who had the authority to lead the party's civil rights strategy. As Nadler leaned over to whisper, "This could get complicated," the cameras captured Crockett's steady expression. The look of someone who had faced skepticism before and knew exactly how to respond. The tension filling the room was about more than just two lawmakers disagreeing. It was a clash between established experience and fresh leadership, between traditional authority and rising voices, and ultimately over who gets to define the expertise required to lead on justice and equality. "If I may continue outlining my concerns," Lieu said, pressing forward despite the unexpected document now challenging his argument. The enforcement framework under discussion would fundamentally change how federal and local authorities interact. This isn't just about intentions. It's about constitutional limits, procedural requirements, and practical implementation. He shuffled his papers, his gaze flicking occasionally toward the document on Crockett's desk that he couldn't quite identify from across the room. Yet he pressed on. "I've reviewed Representative Crockett's proposal in depth, and while I respect her dedication, I have real concerns about whether it sufficiently addresses the legal hurdles it will inevitably face in federal courts. This isn't politics. It's about legal precision." The implication was clear. Lieu was questioning whether Crockett, despite her civil rights experience, had the necessary legal expertise for such a complex initiative. On the surface, his remarks sounded procedural, almost technical, but within Congress, they were a pointed challenge to a colleague's competence. Throughout Lieu's comments, Crockett remained composed, jotting occasional notes but never interrupting. Her calmness stood out, especially as her qualifications were being publicly questioned. Chairman Jordan, still watching the unexpected Democratic tension unfold, recognized Crockett. "The gentlewoman from Texas may respond," he said. "Thank you, Mr. Chairman," Crockett replied, her voice steady, professional, and measured. "I appreciate Congressman Lieu's focus on procedural accuracy. Effective legislation indeed requires both moral clarity and legal rigor." She glanced at the document in front of her, then raised it slightly so cameras could capture the cover. "This is the MAS brief I authored in Martinez v. Texas Department of Public Safety, which established the constitutional foundation for pattern or practice investigations at the state level, later upheld by the Fifth Circuit and cited favorably by the Supreme Court." Murmurs rippled through the room. The Martinez case had laid the groundwork for the very enforcement mechanisms now under discussion. Yet few members had connected Crockett to it since it was decided 3 years before her congressional tenure. "I served as lead counsel for the plaintiffs," she continued, "working closely with the DOJ Civil Rights Division to design the enforcement procedures we are now applying at the federal level." She placed the brief back on the table deliberately. "The proposal before this committee incorporates lessons learned from that litigation, including measures addressing the procedural concerns Congressman Lieu has raised." The mood shifted instantly. What had begun as a senior member questioning a freshman's expertise now highlighted that experience isn't always a function of tenure. Lieu, adapting quickly, nodded. "I am familiar with the Martinez case, Representative Crockett. It was indeed a landmark decision, though I hadn't realized you played a central role." Part of the challenge, Crockett replied professionally, seems to be the assumption that newer members can't have prior relevant expertise. If I may, I'd like to address the procedural issues you raised directly. On page 47 of my proposal, you'll see provisions designed to withstand scrutiny under recent Supreme Court rulings in Thompson and Blackwell, which limited federal intervention in local law enforcement. Members flipped to the reference section. Republicans and Democrats alike engaged closely. These measures were informed by Justice Roberts' concurrence in Thompson, which outlined a narrower federal pathway avoiding federalism conflicts. She continued. Representative Matt Gaetz of Florida leaned forward, skeptical. Point of parliamentary inquiry, Mr. Chairman. Is this a law school moot court or a policy hearing? His interjection fell flat. Members were genuinely absorbed in the detailed legal discussion. Congressman Lieu raised valid questions about administrative procedure. Crockett pressed on, her tone firm. Section 4B establishes a three-tiered review process before any pattern or practice investigation advances. This framework was inspired by your oversight mechanism for military justice cases during your GH service, a model I've long admired for balancing accountability with procedural safeguards. By acknowledging Lieu's background, she simultaneously demonstrated expertise and diffused tension. Chairman Jordan tried to steer the discussion back. While the legal debate is compelling, perhaps we should return to political considerations, Crockett interjected respectfully, yet firmly. The legal framework is inseparable from politics. A policy that cannot survive judicial review isn't just legally flawed. It's a broken promise to the communities relying on real change. She looked directly at Lieu. I share your concern, Congressman, but I've incorporated these considerations from the start rather than treating them as an afterthought. Now, visibly reconsidering his approach, Lieu leaned closer to the microphone. Representative Crockett, it's clear you've thought through this proposal far more comprehensively than I initially understood. I wonder if you could explain how your experience with the Martinez case informs the current proposal's approach to qualified immunity, which remains a key challenge, Lieu asked. The question marked a subtle shift from questioning Crockett's credentials to genuinely engaging with her expertise. The atmosphere in the hearing room transformed from anticipation of conflict to attentive focus on substantive discussion. Crockett gave a small appreciative nod. That is exactly the right question, Congressman. In Martinez, qualified immunity posed a barrier in individual cases. But we found that pattern or practice investigations could overcome that limitation when systemic issues were demonstrated. She pulled another document from her portfolio. This statistical analysis from Martinez demonstrates how establishing pattern evidence created accountability, even when individual claims were blocked by qualified immunity. She signaled to a committee aide who began distributing copies to members. As the representatives reviewed the data, Crockett continued, the current proposal builds on that approach, creating what I call pattern gateways, a system allowing for systemic accountability, while respecting the Supreme Court's rulings on individual officer liability. The technical dialogue continued for several minutes, with Lieu asking increasingly detailed questions and Crockett providing clear, informed answers. What had begun as a public challenge to her credentials evolved into one of the most substantive policy exchanges the committee had seen in months. Representative Zoe Lofgren, a senior Democrat with extensive legal experience, finally spoke up. Mr. Chairman, this is exactly the kind of informed, detailed policy development Congress should model. Representative Crockett has clearly done her homework, and then some. Cameras captured the changing expressions of committee members. Skepticism shifted to engagement, and several Republicans who had initially relished the intra-party tension were now genuinely attentive. Crockett maintained her calm composure, yet her quiet authority in the room was unmistakable. The discussion hadn't followed the expected path of escalating conflict. Instead, it elevated the conversation to a level of substance rarely seen in congressional hearings, leaving even the chairman unsure how to proceed. As the scheduled questioning reached its midpoint, Lieu's challenge to Crockett's qualifications had transformed into a rare example of Washington witnessing a genuine, substantive policy discussion between knowledgeable lawmakers. Chairman Jordan, increasingly frustrated that his hopes for democratic infighting had given way to a demonstration of policy expertise, attempted to redirect. While this legal discussion is fascinating, perhaps we should return to the political implications, Crockett, smooth but firm, interjected again. Mr. Chairman, the legal framework and political considerations are inseparable. A policy that cannot survive judicial review isn't merely legally flawed. It's a broken promise to communities seeking real change. She turned to Lieu. I share your concerns, Congressman, but my approach has incorporated these factors from the start, rather than treating them as afterthoughts. Now, visibly reassessing, Lieu leaned forward. Representative Crockett, it's clear you thought this proposal through far more thoroughly than I initially appreciated. I've also prepared a tiered implementation schedule to address differences in resources across jurisdictions, Crockett added, presenting a detailed chart. There are 3 tracks based on department size, budget, and oversight capacity. Smaller departments receive technical support and longer compliance timelines, while larger departments are subject to more immediate requirements. This isn't just enforcement, it's capacity building. 40% of the funding is allocated to help resource-limited departments build the infrastructure necessary to meet these standards. Lieu nodded. That answers one of my main concerns. But what about politically motivated investigations? The Trump administration showed how executive agencies can be weaponized. Another excellent question, Crockett replied. Sections 32 to 36 establish a bipartisan review commission, requiring supermajority approval before investigations can target politically sensitive departments. This framework was inspired by your 2019 Georgetown Law Journal article on depoliticizing Justice Department operations, which I referenced in the footnotes. The moment Crockett revealed that she had not only studied Lieu's academic work, but incorporated into her proposal, visibly shifted his demeanor. The change was subtle but unmistakable. From a senior lawmaker scrutinizing a junior colleague to appear engaged in genuine collaboration. I wasn't aware you had included those elements, he admitted, his tone noticeably warmer. Your scholarship on this topic predates both of our congressional careers. Crockett responded calmly. Good ideas should never be limited by seniority or committee assignments. What had started as a questioning of her qualifications had now evolved into a demonstration of how substantive policy development can work across different experience levels. Representative Sheila Jackson Lee, a senior member, sought recognition. Mr. Chairman, this is exactly how Congress should operate. 2 members with legal expertise engaging meaningfully on complex policy rather than scoring political points. It's refreshing. Several members, including some Republicans, nodded in agreement, acknowledging the exchange's constructive tone. Lieu, now fully participating as a collaborator rather than challenger, asked, I appreciate your incorporation of these safeguards. How does this framework interact with the existing consent decrees in various jurisdictions? Crockett, without hesitation, pulled another document from her portfolio. We've mapped all 37 active consent decrees, she explained. This matrix shows how the new framework supplements rather than replaces existing agreements, creating accountability continuity across administrations. As the document circulated, Representative Don Bishop, a Republican from North Carolina, shook his head in reluctant admiration. Mr. Chairman, I disagree with nearly every policy goal the Texas representative is proposing, but I cannot question her preparation or expertise. This is the most thoroughly developed proposal I've seen this session. Crockett had achieved a rare triumph without raising her voice, showing frustration, or responding defensively. She had established not only her credentials, but her commanding knowledge of the subject. Chairman Jordan, realizing his hope for democratic infighting had backfired, moved to conclude the exchange. The gentleman's time has expired. Mr. Chairman, may I request 1 additional minute? Lieu interjected. Bound by committee rules, Jordan nodded reluctantly. Lieu turned to Crockett. Representative, I began by questioning whether you had the right background to lead this initiative. I was wrong, and I want to acknowledge that publicly. Murmurs ran through the room at this unusual admission. Your grasp of both the legal foundations and implementation challenges surpasses what I expected, he continued. I'd like to withdraw my earlier reservations and instead ask if you would consider me as a co-sponsor of this framework. Understanding we may still discuss specific provisions? The room fell silent at this remarkable reversal from public challenge to public alliance. Crockett responded graciously. I would welcome your co-sponsorship, Congressman Lieu. Your legal expertise strengthens this proposal, and your substantive concerns will make it more robust. By the end of the exchange, the room's dynamics had shifted permanently. Crockett had transcended a simple defense of her credentials, elevating the discussion to substantive policy debate. Cameras captured Lieu's nod and Crockett's composed expression, reflecting newfound professional respect. In a rare moment of Washington substance, the exchange highlighted how preparation, expertise, policy discussions seen in recent memory. As committee members exited, journalists swarmed both lawmakers, focusing not on conflict, but on the policy framework and the unexpected alliance that had formed. Asked by CNN whether he had planned to co-sponsor the proposal, Lieu was candid. No, I had concerns, but Representative Crockett's mastery of the legal complexities and her thoughtful safeguards convinced me this is legislation worth advancing. With refinements we'll collaborate on. Crockett handled questions with the same composure she showed during the hearing. This isn't about personalities or hierarchy, she told MSNBC. It's about creating effective policy capable of withstanding judicial review and real-world implementation challenges. Congressman Lieu raised valid points and his input makes the proposal stronger. Within hours, clips of the exchange circulated on social media, but instead of viral confrontations, users shared what many called a masterclass in congressional preparation. The hashtag prepared Crockett began trending, with legal academics and policy experts praising the substantive nature of the discussion. By evening, political talk shows were dissecting the broader impact of the exchange. On CNN's Anderson Cooper 360, analyst David Axelrod remarked, "What made this remarkable wasn't just Crockett's mastery of the material. She didn't react defensively or counterattack. She demonstrated such clear expertise that the question of credentials became irrelevant." Even on Fox News, LaVar Ingraham acknowledged Crockett's effectiveness, though from a different perspective. Democrats showed a level of policy seriousness today that Republicans should notice. While I may not support the proposal itself, the preparation was undeniable. GOP lawmakers need similar substantive depth to respond effectively. Behind the scenes, political calculations were shifting quickly. Democratic leadership, previously cautious about advancing Crockett's ambitious framework, now recognized both its policy depth and bipartisan potential. Speaker Hakeem Jeffries summoned Lieu and Crockett to his office the next morning. "This is exactly the kind of substantive legislating Americans want to see," Jeffries told them, according to staff. "We'll give this framework priority for floor consideration, and I want both of you front and center in the public discussion." For Crockett, the aftermath marked a significant rise in congressional influence. Senior members who once dismissed her as just another outspoken freshman began seeking her input on legal matters across other legislation. Committee chairs started reserving time for her questions, rather than waiting until the end of hearings when cameras had often left. Crockett demonstrated something rare in politics, noted Congresswoman Eleanor Holmes Norton, one of the House's most respected legal experts. She turned a challenge into an opportunity purely through substantive command. Expertise doesn't require seniority. For Lieu, the result was more nuanced but positive. While some viewed his public reversal as a concession, many colleagues and constituents praised his willingness to acknowledge misjudgment and collaborate. His chief of staff reported that constituent feedback ran overwhelmingly positive, 9-1 in favor, specifically noting his choice to prioritize policy over ego. 3 days after the hearing, Lieu and Crockett held a joint press conference to announce a refined police oversight framework. The updated proposal incorporated Lieu's concerns about implementation timelines while preserving Crockett's accountability mechanisms. This is how the legislative process should function, Lieu explained to reporters. Substantive engagement across experience levels, focused on creating policy that actually works in practice. Standing beside him, Crockett added, "Good ideas don't check congressional ID badges." Our collaboration produced stronger legislation than either of us could have developed independently. The impact extended beyond this specific proposal. Committee chairs began requesting members demonstrate subject matter expertise before leading major initiatives, a shift away from seniority-based assignments that had often prevailed. Several committees adopted expertise mapping to identify members with relevant pre-Congress experience that may not be evident from biographies, or committee roles. Media coverage emphasized the rarity of such an exchange in modern politics. The Washington Post editorial board wrote, "The Lieu-Crockett exchange illustrates what Congress could be if substance trumped spectacle." For a brief moment, Americans glimpsed a legislative body focused on governance rather than performative conflict. Law schools and public policy programs sought permission to use the exchange as an example in courses on legislative process and effective policy development. Harvard Kennedy School even announced a case study titled, "Beyond Credentials, Expertise and Policy Development in Congressional Dynamics." 2 weeks later, the Judiciary Committee convened again. As Crockett entered, she received respectful nods from members across both parties. When she spoke, side conversations and phone checking, normally common distractions, dropped noticeably as members listened intently. Lieu, seated nearby, paid close attention. After her presentation on a different legal matter, he leaned over and whispered, partially caught on a hot mic, "Prepared as always. Glad we're on the same side now." What began as an attempt to sideline a junior member had evolved into something Washington rarely sees: genuine professional respect across generations and experience levels, earned through expertise and substance rather than seniority or title. For congressional observers, the incident offered a rare glimpse of how the legislative branch could function if preparation and policy seriousness replaced partisan posturing. For Jasmine Crockett, the outcome was clear. She had turned a public challenge to her credentials into an opportunity to show not only that she belonged in the discussion, but that she could elevate it to a level of substantive policy engagement rarely seen today. In doing so, she transformed Ted Lieu's initial challenge into the foundation of a productive partnership, promising better legislative outcomes for the American people. This represented perhaps the most surprising political triumph of all. The story didn't end there. As the new framework advanced through committee, it attracted bipartisan interest. A handful of moderate Republicans, impressed by the thoroughness and transparency of the process, signaled willingness to engage on amendments rather than simply oppose the bill. Civil rights groups and police reform advocates, often at odds, found common ground in the proposal's balance of accountability and support for local departments. Editorials across the country called for more hearings to follow the Crockett model, substantive, respectful, and rooted in expertise. In the months that followed, Crockett's influence continued to grow. She was invited to speak at national legal conferences, her work cited in academic journals and policy think tanks. Lieu, too, found his reputation enhanced, not just as a legal mind, but as a leader willing to learn and adapt. The two became unlikely allies, their partnership a testament to what can happen when substance is allowed to lead. For the public, the exchange became a touchstone, a reminder that government, at its best, is not about who shouts the loudest, but who prepares the most, listens the hardest, and works the smartest. In classrooms, students studied the hearing as a case in legislative leadership. On social media, the hashtag #PreparedCrockett became shorthand for doing your homework and standing your ground. And in the halls of Congress, a new standard was set. No longer could experience be measured only in years served or titles held. The true measure was expertise, preparation, and the courage to turn challenge into collaboration. Jasmine Crockett had not only shut down a challenge, she had opened a door to a better way of governing.